Good. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to this webinar series from the Climate Health Action Coalition of the Inland Empire. I want to really take the time today to really thank you for being here with us as we have our second talk on this webinar series that we put together. And a lot of you may be feeling a little bit depressed, a little bit of anxious with the results of the election. But one of the things that we need to focus on is we need to focus more on what we can do at the local level. So our talk last month from Dr. Swain gave us a very good opportunity to learn about what climate change is and how it's impacting us here at the local level and in the Inland Empire. And today, what better way to continue this talk than to talk about how do we communicate about climate change? How do we go back to our community and really focus on proper communication so we can continue to build momentum to continue to attack climate change here in the Inland Empire and throughout. So I'm going to pass it on to our CEO, Allison Elsner, to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez. And I want to give a quick shout out to Dr. Javier Sanchez for launching this coalition, the IECHAC Inland Empire Climate Health Action Coalition. And as you all know, this is a joint partnership between Riverside County and San Bernardino County Medical Societies and both county departments of public health. So that's the coalition here. And there are many of you who have expressed interest about getting more involved, and we will be following up with you on that. So one thing before we introduce our speaker, you will receive, for those of you who are eligible, will receive 1.5 CME credit for participating today. And we want to thank Loma Linda University Continuing Medical Education Office for that, for allowing us to provide that. And we will send out instructions following the presentation about how to claim your CME. All right, let's get to it. We are very excited today to welcome Wändi Bruin, Ph.D. Dr. Bruin is Provost Professor of Public Policy, Psychology, and Behavioral Science in Dorn Sive's Department of Psychology and the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. She's also the director of the USC Behavioral Science and Wellbeing Policy Initiative. Her expertise includes the psychology of judgment and decision-making, behavioral science, risk perception and communication, and the psychology of aging. Her research aims to understand and inform how people make decisions about their health, climate change, and sustainability, as well as household finances. She has published more than 130 peer-reviewed publications on these topics in journals across relevant disciplines. Very excited right now to welcome Dr. Bruin. Thank you, Dr. Bruin, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I'm excited about speaking to your group. I am a psychologist by training. In fact, I have interdisciplinary training in psychology and behavioral science. And I originally started out studying public perceptions of health risks and how to design health communications to better communicate with patients about their health. And since I started on that topic during my PhD, I've been pulled in other directions because there's a lot of research on how to effectively do health communications. There's much less research, for example, on how to do effective climate communications, yet effective climate communications are really important if we want to help people make informed decisions about how to protect themselves against climate change and how to do something about it. So today I'm going to give you an overview of research from psychology and behavioral science on communicating climate change. I should disclose, the insights come from my own research on this topic, from my own collaborations with climate scientists on how to communicate their science better. But I promise that any insights I share hold in other research on this topic as well. And if you are familiar with how to do effective health communications, and I assume you've had some training in that, then some of the recommendations may actually look familiar because some of the insights from how to do effective health communications actually also apply to how to do effective climate communications. So as you probably heard about during the last talk in this series, climate change is expected to bring a variety of impacts, including increasing temperatures, more droughts, but also more extreme precipitation, damaging cyclones, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and so on. And which of these impacts you're expected to experience depends on where you live. And climate change requires behavior change, both at the individual level and at the societal level. And when climate scientists talk about behavior change, they talk about two types of behavior change. The first type they call mitigation. And when climate scientists talk about mitigation, they mean reducing emissions from carbon dioxide emissions from transportation, buildings, energy, and products. And when climate scientists talk about adaptation, they refer to protecting people and infrastructure from the climate impacts that are already happening. And climate change communications aim to promote people's understanding of climate change and promote behavior change, both mitigation and adaptation. And so you may have heard of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. That is an organization that was founded by the United Nations Foundation. And every 7 years or so, the IPCC releases reports on the state of climate science and recommended mitigation and adaptation. And then various countries also have released their own reports. Local governments release their own reports. But also individual organizations, for example, electricity companies may have climate change communications in their brochures for their consumers. And I have worked with all these kinds of organizations to help communicate about climate change. So I've been working in the domain of risk communication for a long time. Like I said, I started in health risk communication, but now I also work in climate and other domains. And there's a lot of advice that comes from that literature. But two main pieces of advice are that when you communicate about whatever topic, including climate change, it's important that your information is correct and that your information is clear. But if you look what most experts are doing, you see that they work very hard on getting the science right. So climate scientists put a lot of time and effort into getting their models right so that they make the right predictions or the best predictions that they can. But the messaging is often an afterthought. And so as a result, you have very carefully computed climate models, but the information about those models can be difficult to understand, leading to a lot of confusion. So there's room for psychologists to get involved because psychologists are trained in how people understand complicated topics, how to communicate about those topics, how to change people's minds, and how to change people's behavior. So the American Psychological Association recently released a report about addressing the climate crisis, and they're basically urging psychologists to get involved. And so I've been doing this for a while, so I already have some insights to share. I'm going to share 5 insights today about how to effectively communicate about climate change. So the first insight I'm going to share is that it's important to address the motivated majority. An analysis of the World Risk Poll found that a majority of people around the world is now expressing concerns about climate change. Worldwide, it's 69% of people who are concerned. In the United States, it's around 73% in this World Risk Poll. If you look at other polls that are being done in the United States, they back up these numbers. It used to be that people weren't so concerned about climate change. So a couple of decades ago, no, I think maybe even a decade ago, concern about climate change was much less common. But these days, it's a majority of people who is concerned about the United States, about climate change in the United States. But if you look at climate change communications, they are not necessarily addressing that majority. A lot of climate change communications are really trying hard to convince people that climate change is real, that it's serious, and we should do something about it. So they're trying to convince the minority that is not yet concerned about climate change that they should be concerned. But since a majority is now concerned about climate change, it is also important that we give that majority the information that they need to do something about it. So what does this motivated majority need? Well, so one thing that we have found in our research in different countries is that many people who identify as green or pro-environmental, they don't necessarily know the most effective actions to take. So one example comes from a survey that we did in which we asked people what the best thing is that people can do to reduce the carbon footprint or the climate impact of their food choices. And if you look at people's answers, they focus a lot on reducing waste. So reducing food waste, but also reducing the packaging around food. But actually, the biggest change you can make in your food choices, if you are concerned about climate change, is to eat less meat. And if you go entirely vegan, that will have a really big impact, but of course that may be hard for some people to do. So even cutting back your meat consumption a little bit can already have a big impact, because producing meat takes a lot of carbon, it takes a lot of energy, because you have to grow the food for the animals and they have to eat that food, and then there is the emissions from the animals themselves. And so the meat industry releases a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. So for individuals, eating less meat can have a big impact on your carbon footprint. Then also, one of our PhD students at USC studied people who are concerned about climate change, but who aren't necessarily acting. And she found that people's climate concerns may not necessarily turn into actions when people feel like nobody else is doing anything, and they feel like their own, as one person, they won't make much of a difference anyway. And so people feel that they are alone, that they're in the minority, and that acting alone won't make a difference. And that really highlights the importance of sharing with people that no, actually, a majority is concerned, because a lot of people don't seem to be aware of that. A majority is concerned about climate change. You're not alone. And actually, if you act together, you can make a big difference. So in psychology, we call those kinds of communications social norms interventions, and try to highlight that others are interested in making a change, and perhaps even highlighting others who are already making a change. That's, for example, one of the reasons why handing out an I voted sticker or an I vaccinated sticker is a helpful intervention, because it makes it visible that others have engaged in a behavior that we might recommend. And so you could think about doing that in the context of climate change as well. A second advice I have, a second insight I have for climate change communications, is that it's important to make communications understandable. Currently, what we're finding is that around the world, on every continent and pretty much every country, including the United States, it is the case that people with a university education are more likely to be concerned about climate change than people with a high school education or than people with an elementary school education. So on this graph, you see the red bars are people with a university degree, blue bars are people with high school degree, and the purple bars are the people with up to an elementary school education, who are the least concerned about, reporting the least concern about climate change. And climate change is a complex topic. It's hard to understand, but climate change communications are often not helping. Climate change communications are often written at the university level, and they use a lot of climate jargon, terms that are important for climate scientists when communicating with their colleagues, but those are terms that don't necessarily resonate with members of the general public. And they include the terms mitigation and adaptation, which I defined at the beginning of my talk, in case you hadn't heard of it, but you might have. Because of a concern that climate change communications have so much jargon, the United Nations Foundation got in touch with me and my team at USC to ask us to interview people from across the United States to see if they could understand these terms, and also if they could maybe recommend a simpler way of discussing these terms. So we asked our participants to rate 8 different terms that were selected by climate scientists. We actually worked with the IPCC. So IPCC authors selected the 8 terms that they thought were most central to climate change communications. And you see all of these terms on this slide. And I'm going to only talk about mitigation and adaptation for now, because otherwise we're going to be here for a long time. So first I want to focus on mitigation. As you can see, when we asked our participants to rate these terms on a scale from 1, meaning not easy at all, to 5, meaning very easy, they rated mitigation as the hardest to understand. So it has a rating below the midpoint of 3. So mitigation was perceived as not a very easy term. And then when we asked people to define mitigation, we saw that confusion. They said things, well, I don't really know what it means. And then they said things like, well, maybe it means helping to resolve a conflict. So they confused mitigation with mediation. But then when we asked people about adaptation, you can see that it actually got a relatively high rating. So adaptation was rated as a relatively easy term to understand. But when we asked people to define adaptation, the most common definition that we got was when people said, oh, adaptation, I know what that means. It means turning a book into a movie. And of course, turning a book into a movie is making an adaptation, but it's not, of course, what climate scientists have in mind when they talk about adaptation. So across these terms, people, if they were able to come up with a definition of these terms, they often came up with definitions that had nothing to do with climate change, even though they knew they were participating in interviews about climate change communications. So then we also asked people, those people who did understand the terms, to define these terms in simple words, and they were able to. So they used definitions such as mitigation. When you talk about mitigation, you could say actions we can take to stop climate change. See how straightforward that language is? And adaptation, actions we can take to protect against the climate change that is already happening. And there's something I should say about these definitions. They're so straightforward and they have a very low reading level. So you can test the reading level of the language that you're using in Microsoft Word. There are also websites that allow you to do it, and they will tell you what level of education people need to understand the language that you're using. And most educated people, most experts, and most climate experts, they write at the university level. So, and they use words that are long, and generally words that are 3 syllables or more tend to be less commonly understood, less widely used in everyday language, and also be more likely to be jargon. So mitigation, adaptation, they're both longer than 3 syllables. But then if you look at the definitions that people gave, they use much shorter words. So those are not at the college level. So I presented about this at COP26, which is a climate conference that brings together climate policymakers, climate journalists, and climate activists in the hope to help them to simplify their communications. And I was contacted by climate scientists who had a Wikipedia page, and they rewrote their whole Wikipedia page at the grade 7 reading level to have better everyday language and avoid jargon. And because I've been working on climate change terminology and have been presenting about this to climate scientists, climate activists, climate journalists, lots of different climate communicators, I've also been receiving a question about whether maybe we should change the word we use for climate change. So you may remember that in the past, we used to talk about global warming. Now it is more common to talk about climate change, although the term global warming is still used, and the terms are often used interchangeably, even though they don't mean exactly the same thing. Global warming refers to increasing global surface temperatures, and climate change refers to wider changes in the climate that are associated with increasing temperatures. But there are some people who argue that it might be better to say climate crisis or climate emergency to emphasize the urgency with which we need to act. So, for example, the UK newspaper The Guardian has already decided in 2019 to no longer say climate change or global warming and only write about climate crisis or climate emergency. And you see this terminology in a lot of reports of other organizations as well. And then there are some organizations that prefer the term climate justice because they want to emphasize that there's also an important human element in climate change. Climate change disproportionately affects people in low-income countries and low-income communities, even in high-income countries, even though those people are actually contributing the least to climate change, the causes of climate change. So that's an inherent justice issue that needs to be addressed. Because I've been receiving questions about whether it's a good idea to change the terms, I thought, well, I'm a psychologist. I have the experimental tools to test which of these terms might be better. So we conducted a national survey with the Understanding America study, which is a nationally representative survey panel. And we randomly assigned our participants to receiving questions about global warming, climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency, or climate justice, and then looked at their responses to the term. So the first question was about how familiar people are with the term. And we found that climate change and global warming were much more familiar than the other terms. So you see on this slide that 88% of our nationally representative sample had heard of the term climate change, 87% had heard of the term global warming, but only 76% had heard of climate crisis, 58% of climate emergency, and 33% of climate justice. And this general pattern of reported familiarity was similar for each political affiliation. So Republicans generally, for example, did know these terms a little bit less well than maybe Democrats, but and independents fell in between, but the pattern was the same. So among Democrats, Republicans, and independents, climate change and global warming were by far the most familiar terms. And then we also asked people about concern. How concerned are you about this term? And we found that concern was the greatest for climate change or global warming, or the most people were concerned about climate change or global warming, a little bit less concern about climate crisis and climate emergency, and the least concern about climate justice. And this pattern was partially statistically explained by familiarity. So just to put that in everyday language, if you're not that familiar with the term, it's hard to be concerned about it. We found no evidence that climate emergency or climate crisis were perceived as more urgent. In fact, the perceived urgency was statistically similar between global warming, climate change, climate crisis, and climate emergency. and the perceived urgency was the lowest for climate justice, possibly because people weren't quite sure what climate justice meant. Wording hardly affected willingness to support policies. So when we asked about willingness to support policies, the responses to the words were relatively similar. No word was particularly better. So overall, we concluded that if you're going to talk about climate change, just say climate change. Climate change is it's currently the most common term. It is among the most familiar. It raises the most concern. It is no more or less urgent than climate crisis or climate emergency. And in terms of willingness to act, it doesn't really matter which word you use. Excuse me. So using climate change is probably better. So when we look at our APA report, probably would have been better if they had called it addressing climate change instead of addressing the climate crisis. Okay, on to my third recommendation, and that is it's important to be concrete. So I'm going to show you data again from the World Risk Poll. And we find on the World Risk Poll that there's no relationship between people's level of education and the likelihood that they express being concerned about severe weather. So just to put that in everyday language, you don't need a university degree to recognize that your local weather has been getting worse. And that fits with psychological models of risk perception. So people may form their perceptions of risk on the base of analyses communicated, for example, through complex information in IPCC reports. But people may also form their risk perceptions on their basis of their feelings, which come from their personal experience with extreme weather that they interpret as climate change. So when people experience more droughts, more flooding, more extreme weather, then that may lead them to become more worried about climate change. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons that weather becoming more extreme or extreme weather events becoming more frequent and more severe has probably contributed to more people being concerned about climate change today compared to, for example, 10 years ago. And in an older study from 2014 that I conducted in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when I lived there, we found that concerns about the weather also tend to be less likely to show political polarization. So for that study, we did a survey with people in a flood-prone area in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and found that there was no political polarization in terms of perceptions of flooding having become more frequent. There was political polarization on whether or not the increased frequency of severe weather was due to climate change. So that means if you're talking to people about adaptation or protecting yourself against severe weather, you can just focus your communication on talking about the weather getting worse, and that will be easier to get bipartisan support. If you have to mention climate change, or if you mention climate change, it may create political polarization. So that makes especially communications about mitigation more difficult, because when you talk about climate change mitigation, that means having to talk about how carbon dioxide emissions contribute to the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere that can lead to climate change causing more severe weather. And then you do have to link the weather to climate change. The fourth insight that I want to share is to emphasize the key message. So this is another project with the IPCC. IPCC reports and other climate reports coming from different agencies tend to have quite complicated graphs. And so on this slide, you see one of those graphs. I'm not going to explain the graph. The point is that the IPCC had a concern that the graphs might be too complex. And the graphs are especially designed for international policymakers as well as practitioners and members of the general public around the world. But the main target audience of their graphs are international policymakers. So what we did is we worked with the IPCC to recruit international policymakers who are actually users of IPCC reports. And we asked those policymakers to participate in interviews in which we showed them graphs that were drafted for an upcoming IPCC report. And then we interviewed those policymakers about the graph to see what they thought and if they had recommendations for improvement. And there's a whole paper that details everything that the policymakers said, or the big themes that came out of those interviews, but I'm just going to highlight a couple. So the main complaint was policymakers complained about the titles being obscure. So those climate graphs all use very scientific titles, and they just didn't really make it clear what the key message was for policymakers. So one of our interviewees complained, as a policymaker, what is the key message here? And they wanted that to be shown in the title. Then they also complained that there was just too much information in those graphs. There are too many lines and that are overlapping, and then those bands of uncertainty are overlapping and make it very difficult to read the graph. And then another thing that we found is that some of our interviewees said, well, this IPCC graph doesn't feel as good as the UNEP graph at simply capturing the issue. And then we discovered that UNEP is an organization that is actually in the business of, whenever an IPCC report comes out, UNEP recreates the IPCC graphs in a more simpler way. And that may be a good thing because somebody is simplifying the IPCC graphs, but it's also potentially a bad thing because if other organizations are simplifying IPCC graphs, they may not put in the graphs what the IPCC has worked so hard on to put in their graphs. And so it might be better to do with the IPCC just to make sure that the graphs are simple and easy for the target audience to understand. So best practices in graphs. So there's a whole literature on how to design graphs and what kind of graphs people understand the best. And those that literature suggests that graphs should remove irrelevant visual clutter, by which it's basically the jargon of graph designers. By visual clutter, they mean remove information that is not central to your key message. Just draw attention to, if you only have information in the graph that is relevant to your key message, then people's eyes are drawn to that and not distracted by visual clutter. And that facilitates bottom-up processing because you look at the information, your eye is drawn to the information. It helps you to see what's most important right away. And then it's important to use titles and captions, this text underneath the graphs, to support the key message in the graph. Because if you have titles and captions that explain how to read the graph or what the key message is in the graph, then that facilitates top-down processing. If I see a title that says how I'm supposed to interpret the key message in the graph, then when I look at the graph, I already have that key message in mind, which then helps me to look at the graph to find out how the key message is supported. And that's called top-down processing. So then we started Googling basically for IPCC graphs and found there are lots of organizations that are trying to simplify IPCC graphs. And for example, here is a graph by Carbon Brief. That is an organization that simplifies IPCC graphs. And you can see that this graph is doing what our international policymakers wanted the IPCC to do. First thing it does, it has a title, it states the key message. The title says, greenhouse emissions remain far off track for global climate goals. And then there are labels in the graphs, and if you just read through them, you get the main message of the graph. But another thing that Carbon Brief has done here is that they have removed the error bands around the lines, and in the IPCC, it is considered very important to express uncertainty in those error bands. And some of our policymakers also express the importance of expressing uncertainty in the graphs. So the carbon brief here does in part what the international policymakers wanted, but they also changed the graph in the way that the IPCC probably wouldn't support. And then we also found an even more simplified graph by the Deutsche Welle, which is an organization of climate journalists. And their graph is super simple. It asks a question and then it answers it through the labeling in the graph. It only shows 3 lines, so it can show error bands that are non-overlapping. So the main point here is that if you're communicating about something and you're releasing complex information that your audience doesn't understand, your audience may go elsewhere to get that information. And that information that they find elsewhere may or may not be in line with the message that you have in mind as a communicator. So we designed a graph design, or we created a graph design checklist that basically will help graph designers address everything that our policymakers that we interviewed asked about. And all of these points actually also fit with recommendations from the graph design checklist. So make sure that there's one key message per graph, that the message is relevant to policymakers, that the message can be understood from the graph without seeing the caption or the title, but that the caption and title support that key message in the graph. And then also, of course, it's important to do interviews with members of the intended audience, just like I did for this study, because just because you follow the graph design checklist, that should make your graphs easier to understand, but specific audiences may have specific expectations or specific gaps in their knowledge that may need to address with the graphs. And so doing some interviews to see how people respond to the graphs and what they would like to see in the graphs to be more useful for them, that can be very helpful. So the final version that the IPCC created still looks relatively complex to me. But one thing that it does is that it has a title that states the key message. So I should say, I am not an IPCC author. I am just a lowly psychologist who interviewed policymakers and gave all that information back to IPCC authors. So we gave them the interviews, our interpretation of the interviews. We gave them the graph design checklist. We gave them the graphs that we found online that were simplified versions of IPCC graphs. And then it was out of our hands because we were not on the IPCC authorship team. We had no control over what the IPCC was going to do with it. But if you look at the final IPCC report, and this is the report that came out in 2022, actually, you see that almost all of the graphs have a title that states the key message. And so that should help international policymakers to interpret those graphs. And so they tried really hard to emphasize the key message. This is the report. Okay, 5th message. And now I'm running out of time, so I'll go through this quickly. The 5th message, it's important to use positive framing in your messages. And as an example here, I'm going to talk about eating vegan food. So I'm a vegan myself, I should disclose. And I've noticed that a lot of vegan products, though, and a lot of vegan restaurants are no longer calling themselves vegan. I'm seeing the term plant-based more often, and you may have noticed that also. And that may be a good idea because if we did a search of the literature and found that there was, for example, a study in which researchers interviewed meat eaters in the United States, and those meat eaters had quite negative views of vegans and vegan food. And vegans were perceived as annoying, perhaps a little sad, and vegan food was perceived as missing something. And so if the word vegan has a negative connotation, perhaps it's better to say plant-based. But I come from psychology and behavioral science, where we have done a lot of studies of labeling. And the general recommendation of labeling studies is that if you're going to change the label, why not change to something that actually emphasizes something positive about, in this case, vegan food? Because positive labels tend to be quite effective in changing people's perceptions and behavior. So we decided to test various labels for vegan food in a food choice study. So again, we went to the Understanding America study, and we gave about 6,000 people a choice between two food baskets that were actually available from an online store. The first basket had meat and cheese, and the second basket was a vegan basket, and it had fruits, olives, and hummus. And then we randomly assigned people to seeing a different label on the vegan basket. So the vegan basket was either labeled vegan or plant-based or healthy or sustainable or healthy and sustainable. So the labels that I'm showing here in blue are labels that try to emphasize the benefits of eating vegan food. And I should also say, we didn't hide what was in the basket. So people still got the description of what's in the basket, so they knew what the content was. We just changed the label of the basket. And here's what we found. So if the vegan basket was labeled as vegan, 22% of people chose it. If the vegan basket was called plant-based instead, it was chosen by 28% of participants, suggesting that plant-based is a better label. But if we called it healthy, sustainable, or healthy and sustainable, we could nearly double, or more than double, the choices for the vegan basket. So emphasizing the positive can make a big difference. That said, oh, and I should say, I forgot to say, is that so 6,000 people received that choice. We couldn't afford to send out 6,000 food baskets, so we promised our participants that we would randomly select some of them to receive the basket of their choice. So the choice was as real as possible. Not everybody received the basket, but some did. And then the other thing that I should highlight is that I have cut off this graph at 50%. So even when we're calling the vegan basket healthy, sustainable, or healthy and sustainable, a majority is still choosing the basket with meat and cheese. We can just increase the likelihood of choosing the vegan basket if we call it healthy, sustainable, or healthy and sustainable. And this effect was especially strong among meat eaters. And I think that makes sense because meat eaters, in principle, could fit either basket, either the basket with meat and cheese or the basket without meat and cheese could fit in their diet. But if you're vegan or vegetarian, then you won't eat the meat in the meat basket, and perhaps also not the cheese. So if you're vegan or vegetarian, the labeling here doesn't matter much because you're going to choose the basket with the vegan goods in it anyway, because that fits within your diet. Okay, so I addressed 5 insights for climate communications, and some of which may actually also work for health communications. So first is, don't forget to address the motivated majority. A lot of people are concerned about climate change, and climate change communications are not doing a very good job at addressing that motivated majority. They may need better information about what they can do, and they may need to be made aware that they're not alone and they can act together. The second is that it's important to make communications understandable. Using jargon makes climate change communications confusing, even for people who are concerned about climate change. And so use everyday language. The third recommendation is to be concrete, so focus on what climate change means in terms of changes in severe local weather. The fourth is communicate what your key message is. So don't confuse people with overwhelming information, but focus on your main point, make sure that it remains clear. And then fifth, focus on what motivates people. Emphasize the benefits of behavior change. And then lastly, psychologists and behavioral scientists can help. Psychologists and behavioral scientists are not necessarily experts in climate. We're also not experts in health, but we have studied how people perceive risks, including in health, including about climate change, and how to develop communications and interventions and evaluate those communications and interventions to see if they can understand, change how people perceive risks, understand risks, and change their behaviors to do something about it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for that very informative presentation you just gave us. Gave us a lot of things to talk about, a lot of things to think about, how we can effectively communicate, especially for a lot of those of us that are doing this on a regular basis and have been working on this. I think it's going to be very challenging in the next 4 years to make sure that we communicate properly about this. So I really do appreciate. I took a picture of your insights of communication. I think that's something we can all be able to use and utilize when we talk to our communities, when we talk to our neighbors, when we talk to our colleagues, and when we go ahead and just talk in general about climate change. We do have a few questions here that our audience was able to put forth on the chat. We're going to go through those, and then after we go through those, if anybody has any questions from the audience at that point, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. So let's start with the first question. Let me bring that up here. Does disinformation or misinformation have any measurable effects on climate change concerns?
Yes, it does. Yes, and misinformation is an increasing concern, both in health and climate communications. And the more information gets repeated, the more people believe it's true, and especially if it gets repeated by sources that they trust. Now, for a lot of people, their doctor is actually someone they trust. And so I think you have the opportunity to make a difference.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I'll just point out a couple of things. One is study after study clearly shows that people trust healthcare providers. They actually trust nurses a lot more than they do doctors. And then secondly, they trust doctors. So any of us who are in the healthcare field, anytime we have an opportunity to talk about climate change and bring this up to our patients, they will listen and they will trust the information we provide. The other thing is to really understand the differences between misinformation, which is just false information in general. There's no intent. Whereas disinformation is actually incorrect because there's also an intent to mislead people on that. So we need to be aware of that. The second question that we have here is, how do you suggest we use communications as a tool to respond to climate deniers?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot. Excuse me. I'm actually recovering from COVID, and I'm very glad I didn't cough during my talk. Now that I'm done with my talk, it's coming up. I apologize. So I get a lot of questions about how to deal with climate deniers. And I hope it's okay that I first want to emphasize we have to think about how to address the climate deniers, but let's not forget about that majority that is already on board with the message that climate change is real, because they're being forgotten. They're hardly receiving any information, and they're just doing things that are not necessarily the biggest things that they actually can do to make a difference, and they often feel alone. And so communications are needed for the people who are already on board with the message. But anyway, climate deniers. So climate deniers are in the minority. A lot of the people who don't think climate change is real or serious are actually more unsure than that they're actually deniers. And that, again, I think gives room for trusted sources to reach out to these people and make a difference. If they receive information from a trusted healthcare provider, then they might be willing to change their mind. The climate deniers, I think, are going to be the hardest to change because they are not concerned, and they're confident that they're not concerned. Like they're not unsure about it at all. They may even have information that they have found somewhere to back up their denying the denial. And so it's going to be hard to change those deniers' minds. But we can still think about ways of working with them, especially on climate change adaptation, where the goal is to protect people against extreme weather events that are happening in their, or expected to happen in their communities. So to protect against more droughts or more flooding, they don't have to be on board with the idea that it's climate change. They only have to be on board with the idea that droughts or flooding or both are becoming more common in their area, and it's important to do something about it.
Yeah, I do like how you emphasize that the majority of people know that climate change is real and we should focus on that. So the next question that was put forth is, as part of being correct, how can we help people understand that the scientific conclusions do change and get updated? New evidence may adjust for better or worse the scientific understanding of any particular climate change effect.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, so this was especially a challenge, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it was very obvious that recommendations were being were changing over time. And so whenever we're in a situation with a new risk where the experts might still be learning as the situation is unfolding, it's really important to be clear from the start that you're doing the best you can with the data that you have. In the context of climate change, though, the message hasn't really been changing that much for decades. There is a new IPCC report every 7 years. I'm not a climate scientist, so I may have been missing important details, but to me, the message seems to have been the same for all these times, and the differences between the reports seem to be small to me. But either way, expressing that you're doing the best with the data that you have might always be important. And then when you update, explain why the change in recommendation. Like, what did you learn that made you change your mind, so that people can follow your reasoning?
Yeah, and as for those of us in healthcare, and I do emphasize this to my patients, is that evidence change. So whatever we were telling you 5 years ago may be different, especially when we talk about medications that we're using for congestive heart failure, for anything, and try to make it clear. And that's sort of part of the scientific method, that as we get more evidence that supports what we're doing, we do change things. So the next question here is, would linking mitigation to adaptation help make adaptation more acceptable to people?
I'm not sure that it so it's actually mitigation that gets more resistance, because mitigation is cutting our carbon emissions, so changing how we get our energy, changing our transportation, changing our behaviors that contribute to climate change. And adaptation is, implementing protections against droughts, floods, and extreme weather that we're expecting. I actually think there's more support for adaptation, especially because adaptation doesn't always have to be linked to climate change. Mitigation is the more difficult to convince the deniers, at least, about. linking them together, maybe it would have benefits for people who are already on board with the climate message, who are already concerned about climate change, because then maybe it would be easier, maybe we could do a better job at explaining that in a way, if we cut our emissions, then we have to do less adaptation. Right? So you have to prepare less for flooding if you prevent the flooding from happening in the first place. Same with droughts or other extreme weather events. Yes, but it's complicated.
Good. These are excellent questions, and thank you so much for your answers. They are giving us a lot of insight as to things that we can do. One question here is that, have you studied communicating climate change itself as a health risk?
I have not, but I don't know if you've heard of Ed Maybach. He has been studying that. It's Maibach. And so one benefit of linking climate change to health is that people tend to be concerned about their health and the children's health. And so if you can link climate change to health, then you might be able to make people more willing to do something about climate change. And it also makes it more concrete, right? Making climate change concrete is important. So if you can link it to anything people care about, health, but also the economy, that could make a difference.
And so in this election, one of the things that we've seen is basic communication. It seems like the analysis of this election has been that Trump, who had a very clear message, was much more successful than Harris, who had somewhat of a message that wasn't as clear, especially when it came to the economy. So how do we deal with these economic issues that come from addressing climate change, that a lot of sort of folks may be inclined to not pursue more policy or hear more about climate change because it's going to impact their economic well-being?
Well, I think if we don't act on climate change, it's going to impact our economy for the worst. And so if we're continuing on the course that we're already on, I think emphasizing that is gonna seriously harm the economy, and that a switch to more low carbon strategies can actually also boost the economy. Another thing that I want to say is that I've seen people say things about how Trump is using such simple language, and Harris seems much more sophisticated. But I think that that is the wrong way to look at it. Using everyday language is what is important when communicating with the general population. People in the United States do not necessarily they don't all have a college degree. And if you talk to them as if they have a college degree, that is off-putting, it is confusing, it is not as clear and compelling. And so speaking in everyday language about topics that people care about, including the economy, I think is important.
Good. So that also leads me to just let you know that we are going to talk about the economy and the impact of the economy, climate change. That's actually our next webinar on December 11th. So hopefully all of you can join us so you can hear more from our local leaders here in the Inland Empire. And then the issue comes up is that sometimes the people who are supposed to be in charge of addressing climate change are not necessarily in favor of addressing climate change, like the Surgeon General of Florida. How would you sort of communicate to those individuals in those areas where the message may be very different than what sort of the consensus is?
I think it's important when communicating about climate change to link it to the local concerns. So the local weather, the things that local people are concerned about in the language that resonates with the local people.
Good. So again, thank you so much for taking the time. It was just fantastic presentation.
Actually, we have 10
Oh.
more minutes, Dr.
Oh, we do?
Sanchez. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay.
If
So
that's okay
with
with
that
Dr.
said,
Bruin.
does anybody have a question who's still on with us? Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Dr. Sequeira, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Michael Sequeira. I'm the health officer for San Bernardino County. And first, thank you for your excellent presentation. I think it really touches on things that, the whole thing of how you present something is almost as important as the actual content. I wanted to point something out, and that's the triggering of cognitive bias. And that's something that really inhibits communication sometimes. And if you allow it, I'll give two examples. One, when you started out climate change with "don't eat meat," there's a significant anti-vegetarian, vegan element to especially the uneducated population. And so if we bring something that potentially triggers like that, that actually may induce a type of cognitive bias to the audience. The other thing that, and I think Dr. Sanchez, what we can maybe talk about with the environment, but as when we get together our community-based groups, our business groups, particularly when we bring up one, you have to say one word and they shut down on climate change, and that's warehouses. Which is really interesting because we tried to get some stuff in with regard to our transformation plans and with regard to climate change, and the business people, the whole business association said, if you want to talk about warehouses, we're not talking. So it's really interesting, and it's a very complicated issue, of course, because warehouses have brought more jobs, have improved for the other social drivers of or social determinants of health. So anyway, back to the original point was just triggering cognitive bias, and I think we need to be careful of how we do that. So.
Yeah, you're right. So we've been doing interview. I'm also working on food insecurity and food choices, and so one of my postdocs has recently completed interviews with people in low-income communities in LA County about their food choices. And one of the things we found is that some people think it's really important to eat a lot of red meat. They think that that's healthy. So that, yeah. And so, but that means that there's a room for health communication there too. Because from what I understand, eating a lot of red meat is actually not good for our health. And so, so I think some of these topics can be brought up, but they have to be brought up perhaps not in the context of climate, but in the context of health. A lot of, at least in this case, the healthier choice is also the more environmentally friendly choice.
We have another question here, Ms. Lynch.
Actually, just a couple of comments on the warehouses. I think one of the big changes that could be the shift of thought. I mean, we talk about warehouses, there's lots of them out here in the Inland Empire, but I think the major contributor to climate change in that is the transportation. And there have been multiple attempts to fix it with rail. It encounters all kinds of political obstacles because you have to put the rail line somewhere and expand it. And that means going through some inexpensive neighborhood. But that is probably, but there's still opportunities to improve, the carbon emissions from vehicles, from trucks. So there are, I mean, it's still possible. And then, there was I had another comment about the vegan stuff, and it's like one of the alternatives to, I guess, what's being promoted as part of lab-grown meat, which is actually more harmful in carbon production than meat. So, but that would be lumped into a vegan menu. So there's a potential for confusion there that we have to be careful about.
We have one question that was posted here, and let me read it to you. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions for a positive frame when talking about the effects of climate change, with worsening wildfires, more extreme flooding, drought, etc.? I realize that it's scary to hear about it, and may not necessarily be very motivating when you start to scare people like that. So how would you frame that conversation to make it more positive?
So yeah, that's a good question. So scaring people. So it's often the intuition of experts, not just climate experts, but people in talking about various topics, that scaring people will make them pay attention and be willing to act. But the studies on fear-based communication suggest that actually, if you scare people, it turns them away, it turns them off, and they don't want to pay attention to the topic, especially if you scare people a lot. So we're all going to die, it's all doom and gloom, and you don't give them anything they can do about it. So fear-based communications can work. And in this case, fear and anxiety is what especially a lot of young people feel about climate change. If you want to turn that into action, you can, but you have to add some hope and an action. So we can turn this around if we do these things so that people can do something about it. And so instead of experiencing this paralyzing fear, they can turn the fear into the action. Without the action, the fear-based communications tend to turn people off.
Well said. Well said. Well, again, I think we got a couple more minutes. So one last question, if anybody has a question there in the audience still left. Okay, good. So it looks like all of our questions have been answered. And again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. So far, we've had some fantastic speakers. Our first webinar that educated us about climate change and why we're in a climate crisis. Today, we learned about effective communication and how we need to do that in order to bring people around and understand that the majority of the folks do understand that climate change is an issue. And then we need to make sure that we just effectively communicate with them. We're very excited that our next webinar is going to talk more on the economic impacts and sustainability. So we're going to have speakers here with us, Mr. Granillo, Paul Granillo, who's president and CEO of the Inland Empire Economic Development, who's going to be here to talk to us, and we'll talk about warehouses and so on, and the economic impact and how we can overcome that, as well as we'll have our newly elected senator, Eloise Reyes, who's going to be joining us as well to talk about what the state may be doing to really address the climate crisis, the economic impacts, and sustainability here. So we're really excited with that. We want to make sure that please feel free to join us next month. Please feel free to share this with anyone in your community and your circles. We want to get this coalition going. We want to increase the number of folks that are involved in this Inland Empire Climate Health Action Coalition. I want to thank everyone for coming today, especially our departments of public health, both of San Bernardino County and Riverside County. Thank you so much. Our medical societies and associations from San Bernardino County and Riverside County, especially their CEOs. Miss Allison Elsner and Miss Dolores Green, who are spending a lot of time getting this going. And again, thank you so much for coming today. We look forward to seeing you again. And remember, we are going to have an in-person meeting sometime at the middle of next year to really bring all these folks together and really have an opportunity to communicate and develop some policy that will impact positively on the Inland Empire. Thank you so much. Have a great day and see you next month.